archaeologists unveiling the long-lost tomb of an ancient king ruling Egypt more than 3,000 years ago.
Inside, a perfectly intact mummy, wrapped in fabric with a bit of skull showing.
What if the most important tomb in Egypt's Valley of the Kings has been hiding the biggest biblical secret of all time? Over a century ago, archaeologist Victor Loret uncovered a tomb linked to Pharaoh Amenhotep the Second. But what he found inside was so eerie, so revealing, that some believe it connects directly to the Pharaoh of the Exodus. Hidden mummies, strange boils, and a royal son who died mysteriously. Every clue points to one chilling conclusion. In this video, we'll take you deep into that sealed tomb, uncover the evidence, connect it to Scripture, and ask the question many fear to answer. Did they find the Pharaoh who stood against Moses? The tomb they tried to forget. It began in 1898, deep in the parched cliffs of Egypt's Valley of the Kings. French archaeologist Victor Loret was excavating what appeared to be yet another unassuming location at the base of a limestone slope. The area didn't look like much. Dust, scattered stones, and the fading memory of ancient labor. But Loret wasn't new to surprises. As he continued digging, he noticed the faint pattern of ancient chisel marks, etched deliberately into the rock. These marks didn't scatter randomly. They converged, pointing downward, signaling something far more intentional. Loret followed them with care, and soon he found what he was looking for. A sealed entrance, and in front of it, a small broken statue, its base still bearing a name. The name was Amenhotep the Second. That alone was cause for attention. Amenhotep the Second ruled Egypt during the mighty 18th dynasty, one of the most powerful periods in Egypt's history. He was known for his strength, his military campaigns, and his stubbornness, traits not lost on those who compare him to the pharaoh described in the biblical Exodus. Loret knew this tomb could be significant, but even he didn't realize what he was about to uncover. With the entrance now exposed, Loret and his team stepped inside with nothing but candlelight to guide them. The flickering flame barely lit the narrow passageways ahead. Inside the tomb, Loret made a chilling observation. The site had already been looted. Shattered pottery, broken wood, and empty niches told the same story that echoed across the valley. Tombs rarely remained untouched. Centuries of grave robbers had ensured that. Most of the treasures were long gone, but not everything had been taken. There were still fragments, artifacts, and something else, something that would make this site stand apart from any other. As Loret explored the gravesite, he saw that the tomb contained a deep vertical shaft, a cleverly concealed drop designed to frighten would-be tomb robbers. Barely illuminated by candlelight and the heavy wooden ladders, the men climbed down. The shaft gave upon a corridor that led to a room with two massive pillars. There lay a corpse clothed in what resembled an ancient wooden bier, gazing through the darkness into the void. Everything about it seemed alive. The mummy's blackened skin and its grimace, grim in the face, turned toward me and looking at me, said Loret. Now, that was not history. That was terror. More deeply into the tomb, Loret entered a larger hall, that is, the six-pillared room, whose walls were filled with elaborate murals representing Amenhotep the Second before various deities. Along the far side, a narrow staircase descended to a final chamber, the burial cellar. This was the Holy of Holies, where indeed the king himself would rest. Loret approached cautiously. The lid of the royal sarcophagus had been pulled away. In most cases, that would indicate that the body was gone from any tomb, but it wasn't this time. Loret peered with his candle inside and beheld a wonder. A coffin still inside the sarcophagus. It was untouched. He did not open it immediately. He backed away, made a sketch of the scene, and planned to return with greater care. Days later, when the coffin was opened, a mummy wrapped in fine linen lay inside it. The name inscribed across the shroud read thus, Amenhotep the Second. To discover a royal mummy still in its original tomb was virtually unheard of. Most had been relocated or stolen centuries ago. Yet here was a pharaoh, lying there in his coffin, inside a lavish sarcophagus adorned with carvings and burial goods etched with the name of Amenhotep the Second. Somehow he remained hidden in the dark, undisturbed for millennia. Yet, that wasn't even the most disturbing discovery, because buried nearby was a boy who shouldn't have been there. The lost prince. Among the strange and shadowed corners of Amenhotep the Second's tomb, Victor Loret stumbled upon something he hadn't expected. A second body, lying in a smaller room off the main chamber. It wasn't sealed in a grand sarcophagus or protected by heavy stone lids. It wasn't surrounded by gold or treasures. Yet, what it lacked in royal ceremony, it made up for in symbolism. This mummy, found in a modest coffin, showed signs that it belonged to someone of great importance, possibly someone the pharaoh had cared deeply about. And one striking feature would change everything: a single lock of hair curling from the side of an otherwise shaven head. This wasn't just any hairstyle, it was the side lock of youth, worn exclusively by the royal children of Egypt. Whenever a pharaoh's child was depicted in ancient art, playing, learning, praying, they wore this lock. It was more than style. It was a symbol of lineage, of divine right, of a future king-in-waiting. The boy found in the tomb still had that lock, intact, unmistakable, and haunting in its fragility. Based on this, Loret began to suspect the child wasn't a servant, nor an adopted youth. He was royal, a prince. The next sign appeared now. Within the same tomb, a funerary figurine was unearthed by archaeologists. It belonged to several of them, the many framed at tombs to perform labor symbolically for the deceased in the afterlife. They were termed habits. Most of the ones made for Amenhotep II's tomb bore the carving of the pharaoh's name. One, however, did not. This one had the name of Weben-Senu. That name, Weben-Senu, had rarely been found in the concentrations of the historical records, but matched against a later Egyptian inscription, a young son of Amenhotep II, mentioned in embracements and often forgotten. The one known Weben-Senu did not rule, nor did he take part in war, monuments, or leave a legacy. All he left behind was a single name carved on a block statue from Karnak. Now, however, thanks to the work of Loret, that name had acquired a body, a lock of hair, and a final resting place. Stunning implications would have made the surprise overwhelming to everyone involved. If Weben-Senu had died before his father, it explained why he never ruled. It actually also went along with a much older and far more controversial claim. The firstborn of the pharaoh had died suddenly and tragically during a time of national crisis. Biblical texts describe occasions when the Lord struck down all the firstborn in Egypt, including the firstborn of Pharaoh who sat on the throne. That moment becomes a pivot on which the entire Exodus tale turns. If, in fact, Amenhotep II was the pharaoh of the Exodus, as some historians argue, then, of course, Weben-Senu, being his firstborn son, became the victim of that last and terrible plague. Skeptics say that all of this is just too perfect. The boy was aged 11 to 15, according to an estimate. The royal lock fits the custom. Names from both the funerary shabti and the canopic jar lid help cement his identity. But is that enough? With a name and a royal lock can come a tie-in of a mummy with the biggest disaster in biblical history. The emphasis, rather, is on the corpse for a lot of historians. A tomb was sealed when Pharaoh died. You weren't going to get one buried in a royal tomb after the king's death. It was against all Egyptian custom. The moment that Weben-Senu finished his burial and was deposited in Amenhotep II's tomb, he died. That alone is in synchronization with the biblical chronology, hence certainly not proof, but gluing one more piece in the puzzle. According to the Bible, the firstborn of Pharaoh died in the final plague. Was this the boy? The Bible's clues. For years, critics of the biblical Exodus account have claimed there's no hard archaeological evidence linking it to real history. But when Amenhotep II's tomb was finally reopened, catalogued, and studied, something unexpected began to emerge. A startling overlap between scripture and stone. The ancient clues etched into the pharaoh's final resting place seemed to echo the verses of Exodus with uncanny precision. And the more experts examined the details, the harder it became to dismiss them as mere coincidence. Start with the timeline. The Bible gives us a date. According to 1 Kings chapter 6:1, the Exodus took place 480 years before Solomon began building the temple, an event firmly dated to 966 BC. That places the Exodus around 1446 BC, a date that aligns almost perfectly with the reign of Amenhotep the Second, if you follow the high chronology used by many Egyptologists. His reign is estimated to have begun around 1450 BC, making him the pharaoh during the time Moses would have confronted Egypt's king. The timing isn't just close, it's eerily precise. Then, there's the death of the firstborn. Exodus chapter 12, verse 29 states that the Lord struck down all the firstborn in Egypt, from the firstborn of Pharaoh who sat on the throne. The implication? Pharaoh's own son died. And in Amenhotep the Second's tomb, as we've seen, a royal prince, Webensenu, was buried before his father, identified through funerary objects, canopic jars, and even the symbolic royal sidelock. Egyptian custom dictated that tombs were sealed upon the pharaoh's death. So if Webensenu was buried there, he had to have died earlier. And that would fit the narrative of the final plague in Egypt. But the clues don't stop there. The book of Exodus also describes one of the plagues as a physical affliction. In Exodus chapter 9, verse 10, Moses throws soot into the air and boils break out on the Egyptians, painful sores that affect people and animals alike. Now consider what G. Elliott Smith recorded when he examined the mummy of Amenhotep the Second. His body, preserved for millennia, was reportedly covered with boil-like lesions, which Smith described as tubercles across the skin. No other mummy in the Valley of the Kings displayed this same condition. Whether from disease or something else, it was a rare and disturbing anomaly, and a vivid physical echo of a plague described in the Bible. Yet, how about the Pharaoh himself? Did he drown with his army in the crossing of the Red Sea? This is generally the consensus, but the Bible is not as clear in this regard as many people may think. Exodus chapter 14, verse 23, for instance, describes the Egyptians entering into the sea, not Pharaoh. On the other hand, verse 28 mentions the waters covered the chariots and horsemen, while again the name of Pharaoh is absent. God overthrew Pharaoh and his army, according to Psalm 136:15, which might indicate the notion of political defeat rather than that of death. In fact, Exodus chapter 14 verse 30 would read, "The Israelites saw the Egyptians lying dead on the seashore. Were the bodies collected? If it were so, then the dull reality was more understandable in case it was true that Pharaoh survived the incident." The Bible account also takes Moses to the circumstance of fleeing Egypt, while returning only after a long time during which the king of Egypt died. This long period is echoed in Acts 7:30, which indicates that Moses was in Midian for 40 years. If such a biblical chronology is to be valid, then this implies that the Pharaoh who ruled at the time of Moses' exile would have had to reign over 40 years. And who would be the only one to meet this among the 18th dynasty? None other than Thutmose III, the father of Amenhotep the Second, whose reign almost lasted an astonishing 54 years. This sequence of events, long reign, death, the rise of a new pharaoh, fits the bill nicely. When Moses returned, Amenhotep the Second, the new pharaoh, would have been a young king likely beset by internal instability, foreign threats, and burgeoning political pressure. That makes Moses' confrontation not only plausible, but also extremely hazardous for the elite of Egypt. The timing, the family dynamics, and the personal losses were all aligned. Not everyone agrees, of course. Modern scholars have argued interminably about the date of the Exodus, the meaning of the 480 years, and even whether the Hebrews were ever in Egypt. Some say the number is to be understood symbolically. Others say it refers to dynastic cycles rather than actual years. But the troubles in all of these disputes are the artifacts and discoveries from KV 35. Amenhotep II's tomb. The body of Amenhotep II held a much darker, more terrifying sign, written across his skin. The pharaoh covered in boils. When French archaeologist Victor Loret first peered into the sarcophagus of Amenhotep II in 1898, he expected the same outcome that had greeted nearly every other tomb excavation in the Valley of the Kings: emptiness, looting, decay. Instead, he found something that defied expectations. The royal sarcophagus still held a mummy, wrapped in a shroud bearing the unmistakable name Amenhotep the Second. But that wasn't the most shocking detail. It was what the shroud hid underneath. As Loret's team began to study the remains, a disturbing pattern emerged across the pharaoh's preserved flesh. His entire body was covered in strange, boil-like sores. These were not casual defects, nor just mummification defects. G. Elliott Smith, one of the great anatomists of the early 20th century, examined the remains for the Catalogue of the Royal Mummies and employed a term seldom found in such reports: tubercles. There were thus developments raised like lesions all over the skin, with a special focus on the torso and limbs. Their nature was perhaps so peculiar, according to Smith, that no other royal mummy displayed anything similar. And this was no minor observation, it was singular in the entire necropolis. The cause of the condition is wholly uncertain. Suggestions range from a skin disease to some rare infectious process, or, plausibly, an embalming artifact. However, the differences were too pronounced for scholars to stay calm. Strangely, the very symptoms seem to describe one of the 10 plagues listed in the book of Exodus. Directly, in Exodus chapter 9, verse 10, the conditions are set whereby Moses and Aaron took soot from the furnace, and they tossed it into the air in the presence of Pharaoh, and festering boils broke out on men and beasts. What they thought was a euphemism or metaphor for some reason now had an at least theoretically possible link to a real pharaoh, whose mummified remains bore the imprint of the signs. That creepy parallel has fueled the theory that Amenhotep II is the pharaoh in Exodus. If true, the boils on his body would move from being a medical curiosity to a physical manifestation of an ancient curse. It's tempting enough to think biblical miracles are metaphors, myths, or embellishments. Yet here was a man, wrapped in royal linens, his body bearing witness to something unexplained, uncomfortable, and hauntingly specific. Critics shout caution. Correlation doesn't equal causation, they say. There are already existing dermatological conditions affecting slightly preserved corpses in mummification, particularly in the resin-heavy, dry environment of Egypt. Mummification can, indeed, engender strange conditions. But even these cynics concede that nothing so like this has ever been seen before. The mummified state is quite unique, and does not have any parallels in the case of the other royals buried in the Valley of the Kings, including those lying in the same cache as Amenhotep II. And, for the biblical literalists, it is nothing short of spooky that the very man who stood face to face with Moses was, literally, scalded by the confrontation. It doesn't just end with the skin, mind you. That mummy, remember, was not meant for discovery. There was no body at all, much to the surprise of Loret himself. Most tombs of the 18th dynasty had been raided long before, removing what royal mummies still existed and hiding them in secret caches for safekeeping. But Amenhotep II was left in this manner: preserved, identified, scarred. With evidence stacking up, skeptics argue it can't be true. So why is this tomb kept quiet and literally locked shut? The tomb they don't want you to see. In the heart of Egypt's famed Valley of the Kings lies a tomb that, by all logic, should be world famous. It contains the intact sarcophagus of a powerful pharaoh, the mummified remains of his son, and rare artifacts that align eerily well with the biblical story of the Exodus. And yet, despite its unmatched significance, this tomb remains locked, shrouded in obscurity, and almost completely absent from modern tours or textbooks. While tourists flock to Tutankhamun's tomb and marvel at Ramses II, the final resting place of Amenhotep II, arguably one of the most compelling archaeological finds in the region, sits behind rusting gates and unanswered questions. When author and Middle East archaeologist Dr. Douglas Petrovich arrived in Egypt with his son to see the tomb himself, he was stunned to find it closed to the public. He'd traveled from Jordan, secured proper channels, and expected standard access. Instead, he faced silence and padlocks. Most visitors would have turned back, but Petrovich, no stranger to how things work in the region, understood something deeper. In the Middle East, everything is negotiable, especially truth. After a few conversations and some carefully placed payments, a door was opened, both literally and metaphorically. What Petrovich discovered was nothing similar to any other tomb he had seen before. Amenhotep II's burial site, the KB35, was excavated in 1898 by a French archaeologist called Victor Loret. Among the finds inside were a host of great treasures: funeral figurines inscribed with the names of Amenhotep II and his son, a canopic jar designating the boy king's son of his body, as well as 2 chambers filled with other pharaohs. Julie Hussle moved there for safekeeping. The tomb, however, remains predominantly featureless and unseen by the public, while modern Egyptologists downplay or even reframe Loret's analysis and conclusions. According to some, this tomb indirectly supports a controversial timeline, one that is rather too close for comfort to the biblical account of the Exodus. Weben Senu, son of Amenhotep II but dead before his father, was interred in the same tomb, which presents a schism with the passage given in Exodus chapter 12, verse 29, wherein the firstborn of the Pharaoh died in the last plague. This creates an uneasy coincidence for scholars who reject a literal interpretation of biblical history. And so, a multitude of theories arose. He may have been adopted. He may not have been the firstborn. The mummy might not even be his. However, the funerary statuettes, the jars inscribed with his name, and the hairstyle that was the prerogative of royal princes argue otherwise. And from that, there is Amenhotep II himself, whose mummy still rests inside the sarcophagus, wrapped in shrouds bearing his name, and has physical abnormalities corresponding to the plague of boils. This is material evidence, encased in linen and resin, but many modern archaeologists choose to ignore, belittle, or bypass the tomb instead of accepting the find. Why is it that this particular burial site, despite all its marvelous discoveries, is kept almost hidden from public view? Some argue it is a preservation issue, some funding, or security. But Petrovich's experience seems to suggest another possibility. Because this tomb holds truths that contest the prevailing narratives, often academic and political. This tomb could possibly house the Pharaoh of the Exodus. This is then one of the most pivotal occurrences in the Bible, and would stimulate a storm of religious contention, revise Egyptian historical reckoning, and put a fair amount of bullish notoriety to it. And still, modern scholars are working hard to dismiss or twist these connections. Why? The Exodus Pharaoh debate. For decades, scholars, theologians, and historians have clashed over one question that has massive implications for both biblical history and Egyptology. Who was the Pharaoh of the Exodus? On one side, you have traditionalist views rooted in Scripture and supported by archaeological anomalies. On the other, a dominant academic stance that insists the Exodus never happened. Or, if it did, it was centuries off from any pharaoh we can identify. But when you dig deeper, a strange pattern emerges. The harder the evidence pushes toward a single candidate, the more aggressively it seems to be dismissed. Enter Amenhotep the Second. His reign, his tomb, and the tragic story of his firstborn son check boxes that are hard to ignore. Based on biblical dating, the Exodus occurred around 1446 BC. This aligns almost perfectly with Amenhotep II's reign when using the high chronology model favored by many biblical archaeologists. His father, Thutmose III, ruled for 54 years, providing a long reign period in which Moses fled Egypt, lived in Midian for 40 years, and returned once the old king had died. This sequence is laid out clearly in Exodus 2 and 3, and Thutmose III is the only pharaoh of the 18th dynasty whose reign fits that bill. What prevents textbooks from putting a siren's blare about this link? Why do modern-day scholars forever espouse Ramses II or altogether dismiss the Exodus as a myth? The argument for Amenhotep II as the pharaoh of the Exodus creates a domino effect. It requires serious reconsideration of Egyptian chronologies, a questioning of biblical sources, and an admittance that perhaps one of the most dramatic events of the Bible left behind some possible prop evidence. It is therefore not merely a question of names and dates, but a war of credibility. It is so strange that the pushback against the Amenhotep theory when you consider how precise some of the evidence is. His son, Webensenu, had died before him. This has been confirmed by his interment in the tomb of Amenhotep II. The firstborn of Pharaoh died in the last plague, as per Exodus 12 verse 29. This is such an eerie match. The mummy of Amenhotep exhibits what early researchers termed tubercles, boils that covering skin tissue. Exodus 9 verse 10 describes plagues of boils that struck the Egyptians, with Moses throwing soot in the midst of air before Pharaoh. That is again set up as a strange coincidence, or a veritable physical remnant of that biblically historic event. But still, modern scholars return and waver. They believe that the 480 years mentioned in 1 Kings chapter 6 verse 1 are figurative and not literal. They maintain that Amenhotep II's son might not be the firstborn because, in their beliefs, the reigning time does not fit as per the Exodus chronology if one goes by the low chronology. But these objections usually seemed less like real counterpoints and more like attempts at putting archaeological records as far away from biblical validation as possible. Why is the evidence simplified instead of explored? To acknowledge such links would be to acknowledge that ancient Hebrew narratives had a historical grounding, thus upending the entire reason. Critical scholarship began applying itself to the enterprise of deconstruction of biblical history, maintaining that most events were invented later for national or religious identity. A real exodus would blow that hypothesis apart. Such evidence would conflate faith-based belief with historical certainty. And that is the line too many in academia are unwilling to cross. That's what they don't tell you. Debate is not whether the Exodus happened, but whether we're allowed to take the evidence seriously. Loret's excavation, the funerary figurines, the canopic jars, and the mummies in KV35 all point in a direction toward a very real unfolding story in very real time. Amenhotep II's tomb is thus more than just one more royal burial. It's a ticking time capsule, stuffed with details that insistently demand attention. And yet, while the public sees flashy headlines about Ramses II, Egyptian grandeur, and so on, this quiet and much more specific case still remains bogged down under layers of academic red tape. And if this pharaoh really did face off against Moses, then what happened to his empire after? Legacy of a pharaoh. For centuries, the pharaoh of the Exodus has lived in mystery, legend, and theology, a figure known more for his downfall than his rule. But if Amenhotep II is indeed that pharaoh, his legacy becomes something far more real. and far more haunting. This isn't just a story about a powerful king who defied a prophet. It's the tragic arc of a man who stood face to face with the divine and lost. His tomb, sealed beneath layers of rock and sand in the Valley of the Kings, holds more than just royal artifacts. It holds echoes of resistance, pain, and a judgment history never expected to confront. Inside KV-35, the evidence tells a story of sudden disruption. The body of his firstborn son, Webensenu, buried in the same tomb, breaks all royal protocol. Sons are not entombed with fathers while the father still lives, unless something went horribly wrong. His canopic jars, his name on funerary figurines, and the unmistakable prince's lock of hair all tell us the boy was young, royal, and honored, but died prematurely. Just as Exodus chapter 12 verse 29 describes, the firstborn of Pharaoh struck down. This wasn't symbolic or spiritual, it was personal, painful, immediate. Amenhotep the Second's own mummy was wrapped carefully in linen and placed in a coffin never to be reopened. Among the astonishing forensic findings about some burials in the Valley of the Kings are marks on his skin described by early 20th century anatomists as being covered with tubercles, boil-like growths. What attracts attention in this regard is whether it was a disease, or just a random condition, or perhaps physical evidence left over from the sixth plague, as outlined in Exodus 9, and festering boils broke out on men and animals. Beautiful words, except that over 3 millennia later, marks of the realness of one real man, one real king, still linger. But what is more frightening than tangible indications is the weight of the spirit. Amenhotep the Second could have been one of Egypt's most athletic and boastful rulers, somebody of great military valor above and taming wild beasts. But perhaps history remembers him thus: the king who said no to the God of Israel. Pharaoh hardened his heart. Exodus repeated again and again. This was not mere political defiance. It was a moral stance, a refusal to give in. However overwhelming the evidence turned to blood, locusts, darkness, death that confronted him. Even now, that rebellion may be enshrined in stone, linen, and flesh. So what do you think? Was this the Pharaoh who faced down Moses? Let us know in the comments. And if this story shook you, hit like, subscribe, and click the next video on your screen. You won't believe what happens in that one.